right. So yeah, I see quite a few people trickling in. They'll join us as we go. So welcome everyone to our Think Lab event. And a very pleasant good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you, wherever you may be. So I'm Tyler Shores. I run the Think Lab program at the University of Cambridge. The Think Lab tackles big picture questions and brings together multidisciplinary students, teams of students and researchers to generate research impact at scale. And we work on kind of bigger picture questions. One of those bigger picture questions is what we'll be talking about, looking at together today. Generative AI, such as ChatGPT, is certainly something on a lot of people's minds at the moment, and for good reason. In many ways, we're all collectively trying to wrap our heads around what the very near future might look like for education and how we learn, how we work, and how we think. There's many different areas that we can cover in terms of this. Some of you might have seen in the news and things that are happening and changing day by day. Generative AI can be used for personal learning, accessibility and inclusivity, collaborative learning, adaptive feedback, or just some of the potential things that generative AI might open the doors up. And we have three distinguished scholars joining us today. I'm so happy that we can have this conversation, this kind of open dialogue together. So I will introduce our speakers. We'll do a little bit of chat together, and then we'll make sure we have time for questions and comments. And because I'm sure at least one person out there is wondering, yes, I did use ChatGPT to write this introduction. Our first guest, Bhaskar is Professor Bhaskar is Pro Vice Chancellor for Education at the University of Cambridge. He is Professor of Political Economy at the Department of Geography, a Fellow of Fitzwilliam College, and an Honorary Fellow of St. John's. Trained as an economist, Bhaskar's research focuses on political economy of land use and landscape level strategies, water use and management, forest management, biodiversity, conservation, ecosystem services, and human well-being, with a specific focus on South Asia. He works with a number of PhD students and early career researchers, and his collaborations with colleagues in both academic and non-academic institutions in South Asia and around the world. He is currently leading a major initiative on decent work and youth livelihoods. He's led large-scale applied research projects that involve interdisciplinary conversations across the natural and social sciences, and contributes regularly to policy advisory processes across the science policy interface. So welcome, Bhaskar. Thank you for joining us. Our next guest is Professor Inger Meeburn, who's also, we're doing this hybrid work style. So we are literally right next to each other in the same room, based here at the old schools in Cambridge. Inger is the Director of Research and Development at the Australian National University, where she oversees professional development workshops and programs for all ANU researchers. Aside from creating new posts on her world-renowned Thesis Whisperer blog, she writes scholarly papers, books, and book chapters about research, education, with a special interest in post-PhD employability. Fascinating topic. And she's also the co-creator of the Post-Ac app, which I think she might talk about a little bit today, and co-hosts a regular podcast called On the Reg with Dr. Jason Downs. Also going to share a link to her new book here, which has just come out with her collaborators, Be Visible or Vanish, Engage, Influence, and Ensure Your Research Has Impact, which is available through Routledge. I need to get a copy of that book, actually.
Put it in my bag.
Ooh, okay. And finally, we're joined by Professor Susan Robertson. Very happy to have you here. You're tuning in. Oh, you are in the UK now. That's right. Fresh from Australia. Professor Susan Robertson is Professor of Sociology of Education, former head of the Faculty of Education at the University of Cambridge, Bi-Fellow at Wolfson College, where Inger is actually also a fellow now, distinguished visiting professor at Aarhus University, editor-in-chief of the journal Globalization, Societies, and Education, and is president-elect for the Comparative and International Education Society. Welcome, Susan. Welcome, Inger. We're happy to have you, and happy to have all of our guests tuning in today. So I thought we could start with a little bit of conversations and things. We're treating this as kind of an open panel and things. So we'll do a little bit of question and answer amongst ourselves, and everyone that's tuning in, feel free to chime in with your thoughts or questions. And Inger also has a live presentation on how to use ChatGPT as an academic, which should also be quite stimulating. So lots to cover in the next 55 minutes. So here we go. Review, how has ChatGPT's presence in education influence students' learning experiences? How has it already impacted academic integrity in students' day-to-day lives?
I guess I might start just by taking us back to what is actually just 6 months ago, which is when I think most of us heard about the new large language model that was released and its potential and its capabilities, plus all the kind of immediate reactions that followed. This was sort of interesting timing for us because it came at the end of our academic teaching term in early December, which allowed a little bit of time for some calm reflection on what was out there, rather than kind of the immediate reactions that we were seeing. It gave me and a lot of others time to play around, to see the capability, to see what it was able to do, but also where the limitations were. It also became pretty apparent very quickly that there was going to be an arms race within the tech companies, and everyone was going to release a version of their own models. They'd all been working on them. ChatGPT sort of jumped the gun and was the first to release, but almost immediately it became apparent that the others would follow. By which it became apparent that this was soon going to become ubiquitous. So the question of prohibiting its use would really not be a feasible one for any sensible educational institution. We would have to find ways to understand it and to adapt to its presence in the educational learning and teaching environment. In some ways, we didn't need to change too much because certainly our submission guidelines expect students to be submitting original work. We expect them not to be colluding with each other. We expect them not to be plagiarizing. And it's not a very sharp extension from there to say that the use of text unedited, generated by an AI model would be seen as unoriginal in terms of the submission. So, you know, in some ways, our guidelines in themselves were adequate for the moment. But of course, I know we'll get into this in more detail because the question about originality is one which is really interesting for us to probe. You know, once you start interacting with the model, and I think, Inga, you might be wanting to demonstrate a little bit of that, the repeated prompts enable you and the model to interact with each other in ways that the question of originality then starts to become really interesting. So we need to understand some of those boundaries. But anyway, unsurprisingly, in a place like Cambridge, students had also become aware of the existence of these models. And I think our student newspaper, Varsity, did a survey with students a couple of months ago. And obviously, people are playing with this. These are bright kids, and they're interested in what's out there. So when a technology is available, I mean, it's now available on your mobile phone, unsurprisingly, students have been using it. But the feedback that I got, I mean, I teach my students, I direct studies, was that they were already very quick to understand its limitations themselves. They're critical and thoughtful student, the capacity to kind of get things slightly wrong, the quality of text that was being produced. Certainly for those who are in Cambridge, who are sort of thinking about their own work quite self-critically, I think it became apparent that actually in some areas, this wasn't necessarily going to be a substitute for the hard work that they needed to do. Sorry, I was you might have lost me a couple of seconds ago, but I was just going to say that just to conclude very quickly, I think our very quick assessment was that with students experimenting, but not necessarily committing in what is obviously a very high risk context where I think at the moment people don't know what the boundaries are and don't know what is legitimate and not legitimate use, the likelihood that they would be adopting it as in a widespread way in order to kind of undertake practices that we might see as academically inappropriate was not a high risk in this current academic cycle. However, it is also very important that we are able to share some guidance, both for staff and students, about appropriate and inappropriate use by the time the next academic year starts. So, I mean, I, along with a number of my colleagues in Russell Group institutions in the UK, we've been talking about these questions. We've had a couple of meetings together. I think the intention would be to have common principles or guidelines that we can share, and these will keep evolving because our understanding of the models is going to keep evolving. The capability of the models is going to keep evolving. So, but it would be very important for us to have something so that people understand what the guardrails are, understand what the boundaries are. let me pause there because I know others will want to say other things, and then we can, I'm sure, pick up on some of the areas that I've hinted at.
Those are great kind of like opening thoughts. Thank you, Bhaskar. I thought that was a good transition, possibly. Ingrid, would you like to show, we've talked of some of these things. Why don't we do a little demonstration of like how some of these things will look in action? So I'm going to turn it over to Ingrid now to talk about, so what does that look like in practice? Like, let's actually like take a look.
Hi, everyone. So I'm a professional writer and I've written now 8 books and I'm quite a prolific author. And I like to take a lot of notes that inform my books. And so what I'm going to do is show you a workflow that I've just developed about how to take notes from a program called Obsidian and use some of the ChatGPT plugin tools. I like to call ChatGPT Chatty G. And I'm trying to make Chatty G happen because ChatGPT is too hard to say. So let me just share my screen and I'll show you what I've been doing lately. All right, so what you're looking at here is a program called Obsidian. It's kind of like your own personal Wikipedia where you can write a lot of notes and start to link them up. I'm originally an architect. We used to draw a lot of prototypes on tracing paper, or we used to call it yellow trace. And you draw and draw and draw and throw out the drawings. And for me, this is a writing workspace that kind of serves that same purpose. It's half-finished ideas, it's quotes from other books, it's my own thoughts. So what I do is bring in my notes that I highlight and put sticky notes in Zotero, and I import those notes straight into Chatty G. So this note here is a good example of the kind of input that I have. If you look through it, you can see there's a combination of things here. Things I've highlighted come in with quotation marks, and then sometimes I'll just write my own little bits of thoughts in between the quotation marks. And this is a common practice that a lot of writers do. Okay, so they're generating their thoughts and ideas in a conversation with other authors. Now, one of the ways to keep your notes tidy, and I'll be doing a session at Wolfson on building a second brain for writing. So if you're in Cambridge, you can come along to that. We'll put the link in the chat in a moment. I'll talk more about the idea of a digital Zettelkasten or Slipbox, where you've got many different notes and you can start to form the writing out of that. And so what you're looking at here is sort of sloppy, messy writing just for myself, talking to the author's work. Now, one of the techniques that's offered in note-taking classes is called the Cornell note-taking template method. And I have some links from Thesis Whisperer, which I'll post in after this. Part of the Cornell template method is creating summaries of all these sort of messy notes that you take. You write a summary, and the idea of the summary is to put the notes in your own words, but also to, later on, when you've done hundreds of these, like you're doing a PhD, is that you can look through your notes and remember what a paper was about really quickly. So producing these little snapshot summaries is not very hard work with our friend Chatty G. So what I've done is plug in and it took me a week to work this out, and I'll be doing a Thesis Whisperer post next month that explains it all, so you don't have to go through the pain that I did, is that I've plugged in a program called Text Generator. You can see Text Generator sits up here, and it's got a number of built-in prompts for Chatty G, and they are here. So they're like little style sheets or a way of talking through the back door to Chatty G. Most of us are used to just going into the front interface and asking a question. This way we can give it a bunch of text, thousands of words at a time, and get it to do things with those words. So it really expands out the use of Chatty G beyond just that conversational piece. So for instance, I've got ChatGPT template here called Summarize. And what this does, it talks in the background to Chatty G and says, take the content that I've got in my note, act like a research assistant, summarize the content for inclusion in an academic paper in no more than 250 words. It's important to tell it how you want it to act. It's going to set the tone of the output that you get. And telling it to pretend to be a screenwriter, to pretend to be an actor is a really powerful way of using Chatty G. I've also given it a context where the output's going to go. It's going to go into an academic paper. And I've asked it to constrain the amount of output it gives me so that it hopefully speeds it up. Now, we have got to back up here because sometimes if so many people are using the ChatGPT servers, it can take a little while to think about it. So while the pot's boiling, we can talk amongst ourselves, but let me show you how you start the process going. So I'm coming back here to my note. Remember, I've got lots of sticky notes and quotes and so on. I just hit Command P on my laptop. I type in and find my text generator here. I go down to templates. I'm going to generate and insert a prompt from a template. I'm going to go down here to summarize and hit the button. Now you can see that little cursor there. It's a lot of little dots and it's kind of going. So that's it, thinking about it. I like to think about ChatGPT as being like a calculator for words. Like mathematicians still exist and they, of course, think about maths in a very broad space. They theorize about maths. They have ideas about maths. They're creative about maths, but they still use calculators. And so I'm trying to use ChatGPT here like a calculator. So you can see here, it's giving me the output. So the article examines the critiques of the neurodiversity movement. And I've got my floater over here, which advocates the acceptance and celebration of neurological differences rather than pathologization. The criticisms include that the movement is not representative of neurodiverse individuals and so on. So reading that text, and I think you'll agree with me, it's actually pretty good. And look, I could have spent probably 20, maybe 30 minutes writing that summary, and you saw how quickly it went. So in order, and this is a practice that I've just developed because some of what Bhaskar's highlighting is, you know, how do we do plagiarism? How do we acknowledge? How do we're still really developing that space of thinking. My personal method is just to write ChatGPT says, hang on, and put a little highlighter. So when I go back, I know what ChatGPT has said, right? So always in my database, just as a matter of practice, I start to highlight what ChatGPT says. Now, I might decide after this, oh, now I'm a bit stuck. I want to write some book chapters. I'm feeling a bit bored. I've got blank page syndrome. I want to collaborate with ChatGPT on some new ideas so I can use the brainstorm function. And this is where we get into tricky territory because this is artificial creativity, which I think really challenges our idea of a calculator because it's much maybe more than that. And it can become quite a conversational partner. Whose idea is it when I start to use the brainstorming functions? But let me show you how I do it. So again, Control P, text expander, text generator. Generate and insert, and this time I'm going to the brainstorm ideas. I might just sort of escape from that. I'll show you what my brainstorm ideas gives me because I changed it from the original. So the original set up by the developer, the prompt isn't very good. But in this case, I'm asking it to brainstorm ideas about this content as possible section of a book for students. Again, telling it where it's going to go, what the purpose of the text is really important. So I go back here to my notes and I Control P, text generator, and I'm going to get ideas. Oops, no, sorry. I'm going to go here. This is the problem with live demos. Look, even Steve Jobs had trouble with it, so I'm not judging myself. Generate and insert, brainstorm ideas. And again, it's thinking about it. It sometimes can take quite a while, especially when you've got very complex pieces of text here, long pieces of text, crappy pieces of text. Sometimes I just write free-form notes to myself, like I'm having a stream of consciousness conversation with myself in really everyday language, and it will end up being able to smooth it out and give me input. So here it's suggesting a bunch of subsections that perhaps I could add in my book and I could start to write to. So hopefully that's been interesting for you as sort of a way to start implementing ChatGPT in your workflow. So if you want more of that, you can come along. I'm giving a talk next Tuesday night. We'll put the link in the show notes. Sorry, show notes. I'm treating it like a podcast.
In the chat, we've got it.
The chat.
We've got it in the chat.
I've got a bunch of links there, and I will just paste them into the chat. But I am doing some more on this. We're talking about doing a hackathon here at Cambridge. We haven't worked it out yet, Tyler, have we?
We will, though.
Helping people to set up Obsidian and set up ChatGPT like this. But anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. First of all, I love the word calculator idea that captures quite a bit. I thought that was wonderfully interesting, even just watching that in practice. I'm curious for anyone, once we get into the discussion and conversation part, if anyone else is using ChatGPT, generative AI, ChatEG in their workflow, and like, what things have you kind of evolved along the way? Have you found other things that are similar, different? So let me know.
I'll put those links in the notes.
Great, thanks, Ingrid.
As you go on.
And I'd like to turn to our third guest, Susan. Thank you for being part of our conversation together. Question for you, Susan, to kind of get things rolling a little bit. In your opinion, are there risks of students relying too heavily on AI models and bypassing the critical thinking processes?
So I would say that there's a risk in any kind of singular source, really. And this, for example, just a complete reliance on ChatGPT, if we take Inga's kind of depiction of it, that what that produces is really a much more kind of monotonal kind of understanding potentially of the world. But we could go to single source. Let's say if you as a student just read one book, one kind of book, one kind of journal, a Wikipedia entry, any of those kind of single sources. And so my sense really in the answer to that question is that that's a perennial issue for universities, to encourage diverse reading, multiple different kinds of sources that enable one to actually grasp hold of the fact that there are different vantage points and ways of looking at the world. All the disciplines, for example, will have multiplicities to do with perspectives on the world. So that's the kind of first thing. What I loved about what Inga was doing was, and it reminds me, as a political sociologist, I've had from time to time taught classes on the technology and society and so on, and the social shaping perspective, which has been really strong in thinking about technologies and societies, is always looking at helping us understand that technologies shape us, but we shape technologies. And it was so interesting watching Inga be quite creative there as to how she's engaging with this technology in ways in which I think it kind of challenges a little bit of this, the technology emerges and suddenly the world is doomed, and so on, and or kind of almost, not thinking through the kinds of affordances that might be available to different learners, but at the same time encouraging learners to come forward with, critical understandings of the technology. So let me just give you an example of when I was first teaching some of the master's students around the rise of, Google and search engines and things like that. We do these different exercises. So you take Google versus a Chinese search engine versus, let's say, Yahoo. And you get them to do the same search, and then it would come forward with very, very different kinds of findings. And what that does is enable you to have a conversation around the politics of algorithms, the politics of any of the big tech companies, what their kind of preferences, the sort of kind of strategic selectivities that would be kind of built in there. And so my sense is really that is the kind of way we need to engage with really what's just another new technology that's walked through the door. Books did at one point, pens did at a particular moment. When search engines emerged, libraries were going to be closed down and so on. And possibly libraries are different kinds of places, but in my view, it hasn't stopped us doing all kinds of amazing searches into now many libraries distant from us. So think of now what we've got, the multiple libraries that are potentially at our fingertips. So my sense is going forward is to think not about, being overawed or anthropomorphizing, that this thing is out there and suddenly, the world's going to be dramatically different. It will, but there'll be lots of things that if we're thoughtful and critically engaged with the possibilities of this technology, we could be inventive, creative. Yesterday, you'll like this, Bhaskar, I'm writing a paper on kind of seeing like the state, but actually also seeing like the neoliberal state. And I'm asking, and I did ask ChatGPT to kind of think about how does then the neoliberal state see class? And it was very interesting kind of seeing or looking at what it kind of presented me with, which was a pretty kind of hack version of neoliberalism, actually. And where I was going with more recent accounts of neoliberalism was not that one, and so on it goes. So I think engaging in the ways in which Inga is kind of pointing the direction to us, I think is really helpful. One just final thing from me, Tyler, I think having taught here at Cambridge, I've often been kind of somewhat disturbed, I think, by the pressure on us as teachers to identify the question that the student can build up expertise even by writing it out in handwriting, and on multiple occasions to get the timing right. And I think that's probably, they're the days that that's not the kind of pedagogy I think that we excel at. These are terrifically bright students, and asking them to think in diverse ways, in situ often, or with a little bit of time, around pulling different ideas together, so that, just as I was describing with, seeing like a state. So how does a state see if it's a neoliberal state? Then if it's a neoliberal state, how does it look out on social class? Now, it couldn't do that for me, but what it brought back to me was some interesting ways in which I could begin to keep on thinking for myself around that more creative task. So I think I'll leave it there for the moment. But just one final thing. Look, we must remind ourselves, these are LLMs, large language models. It's not about intelligence. And so large language models have huge capabilities, without a doubt. But I think we should kind of put paid to this idea that, it's some kind of intelligent alien that's kind of out to get us. It's another new technology that's walked through the door of the academy.
Thanks, Susan. I think that's a really good point for us to kind of, yes, we've had moral panics basically every time with every new, kind of transformative form of technology that comes up. So different contexts, same sort of questions, same sort of responses, and these sort of things. I'd like to open it up. I'm going to ask one question while people are thinking of questions for our panelists.
There's questions in the chat.
There are great. Thank you, Mark, Nadia, and Eva for contributing.
And there's a question from Steph.
And Steph, yes, thank you. Let me, because I want to see what comes out of this, let me ask one more question for everyone on the call, and then we can kind of open it up a little bit, because we've touched on this a little bit already through various points in this discussion so far. How do we think universities can ensure that faculties and students are adequately trained and prepared to use AI language models responsively and effectively? It'd be amazing if, Ingrid, if you could do this for everyone in Cambridge to see the 5 minutes that you just did. That was in itself very eye-opening, I think, for a lot of people. But any thoughts on that? I was like, how do we scale up? How do we scale up in terms of people understanding, have a hazy understanding of what we even talk about with generative AI or ChatGPT, to all the way to how can you actually meaningfully and effectively use this in your workflows?
I'll have a go very quickly, Tyler. So I think the demonstrations are really helpful. So we had a workshop about 3 or 4 weeks ago, which was open to a wide range of our Cambridge colleagues, and we had 3 or 4 people who were up front doing the keynote speeches, and just actually demonstrating what, in the way Inga has just demonstrated, helps people to understand. I think, as Susan has said, that this is because it's a large language model. People don't fully understand without having played with it that really this is predictive text on steroids, right? We're used to predictive text on your phone. This is predictive text, but trained with the kind of the entire internet as its kind of training model. So as a result, but that's what it's doing. It's predicting what the next plausible word is in a sequence of words. And it gets it right sometimes, but it gets it horribly wrong sometimes. So, when people see that playing out in real time, they start to understand the boundaries. And then it starts to allow us to have a really interesting conversation about, so now that we see what it does, how can we incorporate it in learning and teaching practices? Where are the areas that we start to kind of talk about red lines and boundaries that should not be crossed? So I think it enables us to engage. And I felt demonstration was a really good first technique to get people to actually think about what's possible. And then use cases, and there's so many in the chat already. People are, if you look at what's going on in the chat for this call, people are playing with it, people are experimenting, and that experimentation is bringing forward use cases where people say, it's fantastic. I have a student who's not a first language English speaker, and she's using it to give her some ideas because this is not her first language. And, it's helping her to navigate her way through a learning experience, which is in her second language. So there are all these really interesting ways in which it's kind of breaking down some barriers that might have impacted people's cognitive and learning processes.
Thanks, Pastor. Ingrid, did you want to chime in?
Well, there's just a bunch of interesting questions here, and I'm sort of tempted to go straight to some of these, if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah, we can do that too. Should we start with I'll try to go in chronological order. Would you like to? And I know you were just talking about this. Should we go with Stephanie's question here?
Yeah.
I will start with wonder what the panel thinks about the energy consumption of AI ChatGPT, given striving towards greener carbon neutral campuses. Apparently, it's quite energy heavy. Great question.
Yeah, it's insanely greedy for energy. So if you talk to a lot of cloud-based researchers who are doing computer engineering research at the moment, the big push in there is to make everything more efficient than it is. So I think that's something that our friends over in computer science are starting to take seriously, and I trust that that's going to be the biggest set of innovations in the next couple of decades. But often that's more in practice than in research, but writing algorithms that are much more sort of parsimonious in how they use energy is definitely the future, because that's going to be a constraint. And I also, there's also some really interesting developments in smaller language models. And so that I think our friends in computer science are really interested in cutting that down, but it's a good question because it's very, very power hungry. But as my husband, who's the only live participant in this workshop, because he's sitting over there at the table, he often tells me that websites are really, modern websites are really bloated. Facebook, Instagram, they're really overly power hungry for what they deliver. So that's there's a bigger problem there. That's not to say we shouldn't care, but just that this is a big problem everywhere, so worth raising.
I do know our friends in material science here in Cambridge are working on some really interesting kind of green tech stuff that is right around this. Let me see if I can find a link while we continue our chat. Anyone else about the green energy question? Bhaskar, Susan, any thoughts?
I mean, just very briefly, there's a whole set of questions around the entire political economy of the production of the models, which we should really get into separately, which might take us a little bit away from the kind of focus around its incorporation into educational practice. But I mean, a lot of the training, for example, has been done by people who are very low waged and are being paid for the inputting of these models in parts of the global south. And the political economy of that in terms of how the AI companies themselves are using particular forms of exploitative labor practices is another question we might want to ask. And we're also not really getting into the kind of questions around regulatory practice. I mean, I think that might take us in a different direction, maybe not necessarily what you want to focus on here. I also worry from a student perspective, these are models that are eventually going to get monetized, and there will be an inequality of access depending on whether you can pay for the best version. It's already now GPT-4 is charging for its use. So there will then be questions of exclusion because certain students will be able to afford the best available language model, and others might have to rely on the free and publicly available one, which may not be as good. So that creates inequalities amongst the student body as well, which we would have to discuss and deal with.
Yeah.
That is, to me, that sounds like a topic for a follow-up event. And knowing that we have well over 200 signups for this, and I was like, we could talk about bigger picture things about the societal economic impacts, but 100% agree, Bhaskar, that there's a reason why there's a huge, as we speak, arms race in the big tech companies in terms of how much money can they pour into this, and they're not just doing it for fun. So that is on our near horizon. Susan, any thoughts for any of these topics we touched upon?
I do. I mean, I think, just as the companies, will kind of tell you in some cases what, where something comes from and what its, footprint looks like in terms of energy and that kind of stuff. I mean, I think there might be, Bhaskar, I actually think that this would be a really important, almost necessary conversation for all students coming into the university, but also over the course of the university studies. What's the energy consumption of any of these kinds of resources? What's the political economy, as you said, in relation to how these things get produced? And some of it's actually not a nice story. If you look at what is it that people in low wage countries have to look at because they're employed to view and to take down stuff on Facebook and things like that. And my sense is I don't think we have enough of those kind of conversations. And perhaps it should be almost an important part of a contemporary university's obligatory curriculum in some way, just as once upon a time when I first started, it was obligatory systems, programming and communication skills and things. So I would also be wanting to push us also thinking about this is just not a side event. It would strike me. It strikes me as kind of quite crucial actually for thinking about those things, and particularly this is being monetarized, and it's not only that there are others coming around the corner as well. In which case, as you said, there's an arms race here. So I think that's my thoughts about it for the moment. We can't let the idea of it sitting in a cloud make it look as if it's innocent and virtual with no energy footprint at all.
I do really like the idea of what we're doing is right now in this virtual space together, kind of thinking through these things and pooling our collective thoughts, questions, and experiences thus far is really important. So the more ways we can kind of widen this out, I think it'll just lead to even more important conversations and things that we kind of learn together, learn for us that are speaking, learn from those that are sharing. Thank you everyone that's sharing things on the chat, the links and questions. So I'm glad that we're doing this. Let's get to a few more questions. There's quite a few interesting questions coming up here. Irina, you've got your hand raised. I will get to you after a couple more questions, but I see you. So Michael has a question for Inger here. Curious to hear what Inger thinks about using ChatGPT for outreach, such as in the form of blogging, press releases, or summaries.
Yeah, this is really interesting. It's eaten Thesis Whisperer. So because ChatGPT is eaten Thesis Whisperer, I can tell it to write like Thesis Whisperer. So I can say, write me a blog post in the style of Thesis Whisperer. They didn't read my copyright notice, which said, you can reuse this, but always say that it's written by me and never make money from it. So they've broken my copyright, as they have with so many artists and so many other people. So that's a pretty live issue, and I'm sure that's going to bang around through the court. So, but I can tell it to write like me, which is really interesting. When I ask it to do that, it's not me, if that makes any sense, but it's not me. People read it and go, oh, that's like the kind of Diet Coke version of Inga. And it says, I think as Susan pointed out, it says really generic, not very interesting things, but it certainly sounds like me. So there's a big difference. I think this is where we working with machines, as I am trying to do, to sort of make artisanal crafted pieces of text and use its input to help me kind of move that process along. It does raise questions other people are asking there, is it plagiarism? I'm attracted to what Ingrid's doing there. I see the value, but is it okay? And how do I feel about it? And look, there is something in writing a summary like that yourself and doing the cognitive thinking that's that's required to actually think through, what do I think of this material? How am I going to express it in my own words? There's absolutely value in that. But for me, as a scholar who's got a lot of familiarity with things that I'm reading, how much do I have to do that for my own understanding now? And so that's a judgment call that I have to make. Like, I could outsource this one to ChatGPT because I get what I'm reading here. I just can't be bothered writing the summary, write it for me. But if I was new to a topic, and it gets back to this, what people are saying too about hallucination and it being basically, I'll say in Australianism, it's a bullshit fountain and just make stuff up. And then how do we assess that? When you bring a level of expertise to the work, that's much easier because you can look at something and say, well, that's bullshit. But if you aren't familiar with the area, if you're learning the area, I think you've got to approach it with much more caution than if you're using it to, as I am, in the sort of expert mode. So I think these things, as Bhaskar said before, really need to be teased out in practice. And this is why I'm really excited to be running some workshops here at Cambridge and working with people to implement it in their own work. Because as we show each other these use cases, more and more questions emerge. And there's no consensus. What does collaboration mean anymore? Who is the author? Is it really the death of the author now? Is it just a calculator for words? I don't actually know. Like, and I don't know where the ethical line is. To me, it's really murky. I feel like I'm working without a net. ANU can't put out some, my home university, Australian National University, put out some advice, very quick advice, because we just had to do something, as everyone did. And it basically said, so, hey, it's here now, use it, I guess, be careful, kids. And that was it. And as a working academic, for me, talking to PhD students, where it can be, I think, a really powerful, useful tool, but needs to be used really carefully. I don't even really know how to start having those conversations. So I need to get in the classroom. I need to talk one-on-one, and we all need to sort of start to get some more pragmatic, concrete guidelines, because they're all a bit atmospheric at the moment. Don't plagiarize. Well, what does that mean when you've talked to it? As Mark put a really interesting in the chat example, he told ChatGPT who he was, and then says, I'm an occupational, I think, psychologist. Now talk to me about something. And I had never thought to tell ChatGPT who I was. I tell it how to act, but I've never told it who it's talking to. And does that change the output? I don't know. So not even reaching the edges of the possibilities of this technology. But I'm with Susan. We're going to work it out. Like, we all thought MOOCs were going to kill the university in 2015. Like, oh, these massive online courses, they're going to, and I bought into that hype for a while. And then we get the hype cycle from the tech bros saying, oh, you know, artificial intelligence is an existential risk. I sort of feel like that's a marketing strategy to make it sound cool, but I don't know.
I've heard that.
Yeah.
I was at Stanford during the MOOC when it was just everywhere all the time. And I bought into the hype a little bit. It was hard not to.
It's always hard not to buy into the hype cycle.
Yeah.
Don't blame yourself. And people are talking here about bias too. And I think this is a really complicated question, not to dominate the conversation. I mean, I could bore for Australia on this massively, but we made our post-doc algorithm, which is a sorting algorithm for nerdy jobs, right? So it reads job ads at scale, millions of them at a time, and it finds the ones that are looking for research talent. The interesting thing about these jobs is 80% of them don't say PhD anywhere in it. So the employer's looking for someone who can do research, but they're not thinking a PhD graduate. There's all sorts of reasons for that. It took 2 years to design that algorithm. And it was painstaking work, as Bhaskar said. It was really painstaking work. Let me just show you quickly a screenshot of the kind of work that you have to do to train an expert system like this. So what you've got is a bunch of highlighter pens that got different colors, and you go in and you show the machine what each bit of text means. So if I've got a category like I had one called nerdish enthusiasm, so I want to go into the job ad and find what bits of text suggest that they're looking for someone who's quite nerdy and into what they're doing and can follow down a rabbit hole and get really interested in their stuff. So I had to go through and, you know, highlight that. And then, you know, 9 or 11 different ones, different highlighters that meant different things. I'd find thousands of different, I said to Tyler, I've coded 20,000 job ads like this in the last 7 years. So let me tell you, it makes your eyes bleed. And so I think about those workers, as Bhaskar was saying, who are in the global south for the most part, are being exploited. I was being paid quite a nice level C, level D salary in Australia that was comfortable enough to live on. They're being paid 4 cents an hour or something. We're doing similar kind of work, but you're asking, there's a very big difference when you ask to an expert to design a system and show the system how to look at the data like I do. So that's sort of training it to be biased in the way that I'm biased. When I look at a job ad, I discriminate. If we think about bias in terms of sort of inclination towards or discrimination towards something, training it to look at things a certain way, then that's what I'm doing here, hour after hour, job after job after job. And eventually, and it took a very long time for the machine to learn how to do that. Now, the colleague that I worked with, the previous work that she'd done was with nurses, and nurses writing notes about patients. So someone would have a broken leg, and nurses would have many different ways of saying someone's got a broken leg. Like they didn't have they had their own technical jargon language. And so she was getting nurses to mark up patient records, over and over. This means that person's got a broken leg. This means that person's probably about to die. This means, so, and those nurses were what she calls expert coders. So an expert coder is someone who's biased you want to tap into, someone whose knowledge and way of looking at the world you want to tap into. And what they're doing with these large language models, which puts all these ethical complexities in play, is that they're just, instead of getting a person like a nurse who knows what she's looking at, or a person like me who knows how to read a job ad and find a nerdy one, they're throwing as much data at it as they can. And then they're throwing cheap labor at it to try and fix it up a bit. It's junk food AI, right? It's not artisanal, crafted, beautiful AI. And so the future, I think, is going to be in the more artisanal end.
Yes, that was very interesting. I really like the distinction between kind of like the snack food, the fast food, and the kind of like artisanal crafted. I think that's really
crafted machines of the future. And sometimes in my darker moments to follow that out is I think that our children will be spending their lifetimes training machines, and that both scares and exhilarates me.
And to an extent, being trained by machines on
yes.
trained machines.
Well, the process of doing all that coding, so many thousands of job ads, it's so repetitive, it's so exhausting. You can't do it for more than 20 minutes at a time. Once you've got the model, it can do it millions and millions of times. It's a whole different sort of frame of thinking about what work is.
Questions? Irina, thank you for waiting. Would you like to join in and feel free to say hello to everyone?
Thank you, Tyler. There's a couple of points. So the first thing is there's a lot of worry about how big these machines need to be in terms of the amount of data they soak up and how we use them. But this is not a new phenomenon. It's happened in engineering. It's happened in other fields before, where there's always been a trade-off between having a complicated piece of software and having something which was cheap and simple, but an expert using it. And the most obvious example I can think of, many years ago, I worked on road design, and the government paper on that said, design a road with 5 parameters up to 0.5 of a centimeter accuracy, an impossible thing to do. There was no way that could be done as a piece of mathematics, but you put that in the hands of a competent engineer and it's workable. And I think we're facing the same decision here. Do we want to have huge data sets, which supposedly our students can use, and I'll come back to that in a minute, or do we want to have maybe smaller data sets, cheaper, more economical in terms of energy as well, but they're only really useful in the hands of people who know what they're doing? And I think that's the way to go, inevitably, because at the end of the day, these are not artificial intelligences, at least not yet. The second point is the way we teach our students. And one of the things we try to do, my job here is a CTO, I spend a lot of time trying to teach students to think. And what these machines will do is will make it easier for us to actually distinguish between creative people who can actually analyze data and make useful comments, and people who we all know who work incredibly hard, end up with low firsts or very high seconds, but haven't really understood very much of what they've done. It will be easier to discriminate, and it will actually be a good thing for this university if we learn how to use it and adapt to it and make lemonade instead of whinging about a new technology. Final point. So I actually think there's a business model implication here for the university. This is a way of moving forward and maybe making things a bit better for ourselves. than we currently have. Finally, just because I've got an audience that's captive, we have for many, many years in various departments produced support material for incoming students who have come from all kinds of different backgrounds and don't know how to adapt. I don't come from a Oxbridge background, and I found it quite difficult to adapt when I first went to Oxford. We still produce written study guides that nobody reads in the maths department. It seems to me that we should be thinking now about producing not maybe a study guide, but more like a practical guide, the kind of thing that you get as a workbook once upon a time to learn how to do Fortran. So you had a book with problems and guidance and maybe a demonstrator, and you learn how to do some of that software yourself. We need to teach incoming students how to use these technologies and understand their limitations. And to make an even playing field, we need to do what the maths department has done for early computing projects, which is, in our case, make MATLAB available to all first and second years. We need to think about whether the university is able, willing, can afford to do something similar at various levels: undergraduate, graduate, masters, PhD students, and academics. I'll shut up now. I think I've said enough.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all of those various topics. I'm mindful of the time because we're down to about 6.5 minutes. So we'll go into a little bit of lightning round. Let's see how many questions we can fit in, if you don't mind. I really like this question from Abhishek here. Would love to know the panel's views on how we can address and minimize the Anglophone bias in generative AI for broader inclusivity. Great question. I don't know.
Susan hasn't talked for a while.
Yeah, Susan, would you like to lead us on this one a little bit?
I mean, that's an obvious one, isn't it? But I mean, without doubt, China's got its own AI, huge investments in that going in. So there will be, I guess, the bit of the world we would need to worry about possibly would be, let's say, the African continent and so on. Can I say something else that I think, though, despite what I said, I mean, we're wooed and awed, aren't we, a little bit by the pace or the fastness. And there is something quite important about slowing down and a level of slow and more thoughtful kind of scholarship. So that's also something I'd quite like to put on the table for universities, that being awed by the pace and the fastness doesn't always enable us to be more thoughtful, to be reflective about the kinds of knowledges that we're acquiring, the things that we're putting together. So there's something too about the slowing down and the space for mulling over and reflexivity that I think is incredibly important in our contemporary worlds.
Any other thoughts? I might jump to the next question, but anyone please feel free to interrupt. The philosopher in me really likes this question here. So how should knowledge be defined? Currently, AI, ChatGPT, for instance, although producing much false information, also produces good summary, synthesis, or proposing other perspectives, all of which are part of the knowledge generating process. And because as AI develops, it might be later in the near future, it could produce all sorts of supported claims. In that sense, generally the takeaway question here is, how should knowledge be defined? I think we're all trying to think about that one right now.
Tyler, I mean, for me, one of the more fundamental questions that we asked in one of the workshops that I attended was to ask students what their expectations from university. So certainly the model that some people might have had about empty vessels being filled up with knowledge, that's no longer true. And I'm sure most of us don't practice that form of knowledge production. But what is it that people are looking to get from a university education? Where you come into university, what kinds of knowledges are you seeking? What kinds of critical thinking skills are you seeking? Especially in an adaptive world in which the kind of jobs of 20 years from now are unknown to us. We're certainly not just training people for particular forms of employment. We're giving them skills that which will enable them to navigate their way through the rest of their lives. So what is the purpose of a university education is a sort of prior question. And really engaging with young people to find out what their expectations are. Why should they be taking on what are becoming crippling levels of debt to spend 3 years or 4 years with us is a fundamental question we should be asking. What expectations do they have? And how are we meeting those expectations? Because I think that has really profound implications for the way we teach, for the curriculum, for the content of what we teach, and then the way we assess. So all of that follows very much from understanding the world in which the young people that we are promising to educate in the current and the future, what are their expectations and what are their needs?
Yeah, I agree. These are fundamental questions that, like, we here at the university, others at all universities all across the world have to be thinking about now, in terms of, like, this is challenging us to think about, like, what is the near future of, like, and this is the title of our event, right? What is the future of higher education going to be? There's so many different angles and things to explore. So it seems, just from this, it's a shame that we only have 60 minutes together. Follow-up event is definitely going to be in the books, which everyone is welcome to attend. Does anyone from our panel have any last thoughts that they'd like to share? I have, as a thinking prompt, one of the last things I wanted to ask you was, what are you most hopeful about? And I'm choosing to end on this note rather than what are you most worried about? Plenty of talks about that. But what are you most optimistic and hopeful about for generative AI, ChatGPT, and all of these things in the next 6, 12, 24 months?
I'm hopeful that I can get it to do my email for me.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Completely.
Hit or miss so far right now.
And fill in every form I get from admin. That's what I'm hoping for. I fear that we're going to become an illiterate society who doesn't know how to write anymore, but maybe, maybe some of the judge will go.
I would pay for that. I would pay for the admin
Totally.
part of things. Yes.
I'm really optimistic that it's already started conversations that were long overdue. We were in a very comfortable model of what assessment in Cambridge looked like. And I don't think that was doing justice to the kind of education that we're providing our students. We had a very monolithic form of assessment. My optimism comes from this having forced us to have a conversation that I think was very long overdue.
Any other thoughts, Inger or Susan?
I think I've had
my thought is exactly like Bhaskar, forcing us to have conversations about what is that we do. It kind of shakes the tree a little bit, and we can see that actually we'd rather and should be doing things differently in various kinds of ways. My thought is I'm hopeful for some really interesting things to come out of the possibilities of that technology. And even just today, where we had a conversation around the energy that it uses, its political economy. I mean, maybe this kind of technology, if we get it right in our teaching and our classrooms, enables us to have these conversations around really big and important topics.
I think we can end on that note at 6 o'clock exactly. Thank you everyone for joining us. The chat has been amazing. If I would like to turn this into a blog post, I think ChatGPT blog post on this. Yeah.
We'll put it in ChatGPT.
Yeah, I think we could. So there's a lot there. Thank you everyone for your engagement and your thoughtful questions on this. Hope you have a nice upcoming weekend wherever you are. And thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Inger, Susan, and Bhaskar, for kindly joining us and sharing your interesting thoughts on this. I think we're going to have to do this again because there's so much more to talk about. So more updates coming soon. Thank you everyone for joining us, and have a very nice weekend.
Thanks,
Bye for now.
Thanks for organizing, Tyler. Bye-bye.
Thank you.